He dropped to his knees on a freezing Manhattan sidewalk, a broke, exhausted single dad in a torn jacket, and started pumping his hands into a stranger's chest while a crowd of hundreds just watched. Nobody knew her name yet. Nobody knew she was worth $11 billion. And he didn't care. Because Ethan Walker wasn't thinking about money. He was thinking about the last time he had knelt beside someone he loved and failed. This time, he refused to fail again. But what happened next, what this one desperate act of courage unlocked, would shake both of their worlds to the foundation. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. The cold came early that November. Not the polite kind of cold that made people reach for a scarf, the kind that pressed through your jacket, found every thin spot in the fabric, and reminded you that winter didn't care how tired you were or how far you still had to walk. Ethan Walker felt it in his hands first. He always did. After 10 hours on the warehouse floor lifting, stacking, running diagnostics on equipment that should have been replaced 3 years ago, his fingers were the first things to stop cooperating. They ached at the knuckles, stiffened at the joints. By the time he punched out and started the 40-minute commute back toward the apartment in Yonkers, his hands felt like they belonged to a man twice his age. He was 35. He felt 60. He pulled his jacket tighter as he cut through the edge of Midtown, taking the long route because the subway line near his stop was running on delays again. And he'd already learned the hard way that standing in an underground tunnel in November, waiting on a train that might come in 20 minutes or might come in 50, was a special kind of miserable that no man should choose twice. So he walked, head down, shoulders forward, counting blocks the way he'd learned to count down the last hours of a shift, not by how far he'd come, but by how little was left. 12 blocks, 11, 10. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He already knew who it was before he looked. Gracie. Dad, when are you coming home? I saved you the last piece of cornbread, but I ate half of it. Sorry. I'll make it up to you. Love you. He stopped walking just long enough to smile at the screen. Grace Elizabeth Walker, 8 years old. Missing her 2 front teeth, capable of apologizing for eating his food while simultaneously giving him the most complete emotional restoration he'd experienced all week. He typed back fast, still moving. Ethan, don't worry about the cornbread. Save me the other half and I'll be home by 9. Love you more. He pocketed the phone and kept walking. 8 blocks. Gracie had been staying with Mrs. Delgado from down the hall on weeknights, a retired teacher with a soft spot for kids and a hard rule about no television after 8 o'clock. It was a temporary arrangement that had stretched into its 14th month, because temporary arrangements had a way of becoming permanent when you didn't have better options. Ethan hated it. Not Mrs. Delgado, he would have been lost without her, and he knew it. He hated that his daughter had to grow up in someone else's living room because her father couldn't figure out how to be in 2 places at once. He hated that he couldn't fix it. He'd been good at fixing things his whole life. Equipment, schedules, problems that other people threw their hands up at and walked away from. There was something satisfying about understanding why a machine wasn't working and making it work again. It was honest, clear. The problem was either solved or it wasn't. People were harder. Life was harder. And some things he had learned stayed broken, no matter how many ways you tried to fix them. 5 blocks. He was passing a hotel entrance when the crowd ahead of him shifted. He noticed it, the way you notice a current change in water before you see the wave, a subtle compression of movement. People slowing without reason, phones rising. That particular silence that falls over a crowd when something has gone wrong, but no one is sure yet how wrong. Ethan looked up. 40 feet ahead, a woman was on the ground. She had gone down hard, he could tell by the way people near her had stepped back. The half-circle of space that forms when a collapse is sudden and complete. She wasn't sitting. She wasn't crouching. She was on her side on the concrete with her legs slightly bent and her arms stretched out at an angle that arms don't go on their own. He stopped. He watched for 2 full seconds. A man in a gray overcoat stepped around her. A young woman in heels glanced down, then looked at her phone. A teenager raised his screen. Nobody moved toward her. Nobody. And that 2-second, Pause the space where a crowd holds its breath and waits for someone else to be. The person who acts ended the moment Ethan's feet started moving. He didn't make a conscious decision. He just went. The woman was in her mid-50s, he guessed. Expensive charcoal blazer. Good shoes. The kind of leather bag that cost more than his monthly rent, sitting beside her on the sidewalk as if it had simply been set down. Dark hair, silver at the temples. She was on her side and she was not moving. But there was something about the color of her face, a grayish pallor, spreading under the skin, that made something in his chest clench hard. He knew that color. He'd seen it before. Hey. He was already dropping to one knee. Hey, can you hear me? No response. I need people to back up. He said it louder than he meant to. Louder than felt comfortable, but the crowd around him needed to hear authority, not a request. Somebody call 911. Right now. Tell them cardiac arrest. Midtown Manhattan. Give them the cross streets. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck. Nothing then a flutter, faint, inconsistent. Gone. She's going into arrest, he said, more to himself than anyone. And then he moved. He opened her airway tilt. Lift. 2 breaths, then locked his hands together, heel of his palm over the center of her chest, and started compressions. 30. Fast, hard. The way the instructor had said. In a church basement 6 years ago, a Wednesday night CPR class that the warehouse had required everyone to attend as part of a safety certification. He'd been annoyed about it at the time. An extra 2 hours when he'd rather have been home. He was not annoyed about it now. 1, 2, 3, 4. You shouldn't move her. A man's voice from the crowd. Ethan didn't look up. I'm not moving her. I'm doing CPR. You could hurt her. She's in cardiac arrest. 15, 16. If I stop, she dies. Does somebody have a location for the 911 call? 5th and 53rd. A woman's voice. Young. Shaking a little. I've got them on the line. Good. Tell them no pulse. CPR in progress. Tell them 22, 23, 24. His arms were already burning. Not from weakness, from the reality of compressions, which nobody warned you about in the church basement. Real CPR was not gentle. Real compressions required weight and intention, and the conscious decision to press down hard enough on a human being's chest that it felt wrong. Because that was the only way it worked. He felt something. Not a crack, nothing dramatic, but a shift in resistance. He kept going. 29:30. He went back to the airway. 2 breaths. Back to compressions. The crowd had grown. He could feel it even, without looking up, the pressure of people gathering. The sounds layering. Someone on a phone. Someone talking too loud. Someone saying, "Oh my God," in the particular frequency of someone who had never seen anything real happen in front of them before. He blocked it out. Come on, he said quietly. Not for the crowd. For her. Come on, stay here, sir. Another voice. Male. Clipped. The voice of someone who wore a suit because it was armor, not clothing. Sir, stop what you're doing. We have medical training. Ethan looked up for the first time. 2 men, earpieces. The woman's security team, he understood, that immediately, who had apparently been somewhere else when she collapsed, and were now arriving with the specific energy of people who had failed at their only job and needed someone to blame for it. Do you know CPR? Ethan said. Sir, you need to step back. Do you know CPR? Not a question this time.
A test.
The man hesitated. That fraction of a second said everything. Then you're not touching her. Ethan went back to compressions. You want to help keep that crowd back and make a path for the ambulance. That's how you help. A beat of silence. One of the men pulled out a phone. The other took a step toward the crowd. Good enough. 1, 2, 3. He was on his 3rd cycle when the woman's eyes moved. Not open, moved. A flicker beneath the lids. A subtle shift. The body's version of a system trying to reboot after a crash. He'd been told in the class that you might not see anything. He'd been told to keep going regardless. He kept going. I hear sirens, someone said. 18, 19. 20, they're close. The young woman with the phone called out. 2 minutes. 2 minutes. He could do 2 minutes. He had worked through worse pain than this on a Tuesday afternoon for a paycheck that barely covered the electric bill. He had driven across town at 2 in the morning when Gracie had an ear infection and the clinic wasn't open and he needed to find the one pharmacy that was. He had sat in a hospital corridor at 31 years old while doctors told him things no man should have to hear, And he had driven home afterward and walked through the door, smiling because a 4-year-old girl was asleep in the next room, and she needed him to still be standing. 2 minutes was nothing. 28, 29, 30. Come on, he said again, bending forward. Don't you give up on me. When the paramedics broke through the crowd and reached him, the first thing the lead tech said was, "How long?" 7, 8 minutes, Ethan said, sitting back on his heels to give them room. 3 full cycles. She had a flutter early on. Nothing since. The tech nodded, already moving, already communicating with her partner in the efficient shorthand of people trained for exactly this. Ethan stood. His hands were trembling. Not from fear. From the effort. From the adrenaline that had been holding everything else at bay and was now, in the absence of anything to do, starting to collect on the debt. He watched them work for a moment, the defibrillator pads, the exchange of information, the controlled urgency of a team that was good at what they did, and then he took a step back. Then another. He picked up his bag from where it had fallen. The strap had torn at the corner, cheap canvas, long overdue, and he looped it over his shoulder the way he always did when it happened. The same improvised fix he'd been using for 3 months. He looked at the woman on the ground one more time. She was in good hands now. Better than his. "Sir?" The young woman with the phone was looking at him. Do you want to wait? They might need to talk to you." "I gave them what they needed," he said. "But my daughter's waiting for me." He turned and walked. The subway home was delayed as usual. He stood on the platform with his torn bag, and his aching arms, and his coat that wasn't quite warm enough. And he stared at the curved tile wall of the station and thought about nothing in particular. Because there was a kind of peace in the aftermath of something that took everything you had. A quiet. He'd done it. He didn't know if she would make it. He didn't know her name. He didn't know who she was, or where she'd come from, or whether the paramedics had gotten there in time to make his 8 minutes matter. He only knew that he had not walked away. He had not been the man who stepped around her. And for tonight, for right now, on this platform with this flickering fluorescent light and the distant rumble of a train finally making its way toward him, that was enough. He pulled out his phone. "Dad?" He smiled. "Ethan. On my way, save the cornbread." The train came, he got on. He went home. He didn't know, sitting in that rattling subway car with his eyes half closed and his hands finally starting to warm up, that 3 days later, a woman would wake up in a hospital room with tubes in her arms and the particular bewilderment of a person who has been told she was dead and is not entirely sure she believes it. He didn't know that she would ask, before almost anything else, who was he? He didn't know that the answer to that question would change things. He didn't know that yet. He just rode the train home. And the city moved around him, the way it always did, enormous and indifferent, and full of people who would never know what had happened 40 blocks uptown, on a cold sidewalk, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday evening. The city moved, and Ethan Walker went home to his daughter, and the world, for the moment, held its breath. 3 days passed. Ethan didn't think about the woman on the sidewalk as much as he thought he would. That surprised him a little, the way the mind has its own triage system, deciding what gets to take up space and what gets filed away somewhere quiet. He had a daughter to feed, a shift that started at 6 in the morning, and a washing machine in the basement of his building that had eaten 2 of his quarters and refused to apologize for it. The world kept moving. He moved with it. On Wednesday morning, he made Gracie's lunch peanut butter and strawberry jam. The crusts cut off because she was 8 years old and had opinions, and walked her down to the school bus stop while the sky was still gray and the temperature was somewhere in the territory that made you question every decision that had led you to live this far north. Gracie talked the whole way. She talked about a project on the water cycle that her teacher had assigned, and about how her best friend Maya had gotten a new backpack that lit up when you pressed a button on the zipper, and about whether or not it was fair that the school cafeteria had stopped serving chocolate milk on Thursdays specifically. Ethan listened to all of it. He always listened to all of it. Not because he wasn't tired. He was always tired. But because he had made a decision the night his wife died, a quiet, private decision he had never said out loud to anyone, that Gracie would never grow up feeling like her voice didn't matter, like her small concerns were too small. Like the person who was supposed to be her whole world was somewhere else in his head while she was right in front of him. So he listened. He asked follow-up questions about the chocolate milk injustice. He told her the water cycle project sounded like an opportunity to use the good colored pencils, not the cheap ones. He hugged her at the bus stop for exactly as long as she'd let him, which was getting shorter. He'd noticed in the particular way that told him 8 was becoming 9, in ways that had nothing to do with the calendar. The bus took her. He went to work. That was Wednesday. On Thursday, his foreman, Marcus, pulled him aside near the loading dock before the second shift briefing and said, in the tone of someone delivering news he didn't entirely understand, "Walker, there was a call for you at the front office." Ethan looked at him. "A call?" "Yeah, woman. Said it was personal, not an emergency. But important." Marcus handed him a folded piece of paper. "Left a number. Fancy number. One of those with a secretary who answers it." Ethan unfolded the paper in the break room after the briefing. There was a name at the top, Sterling Global Technologies, Office of the Executive, and a number, and below it, handwritten, in what looked like someone's careful administrative script, "Miss Sterling would like to speak with Mr. Walker at his earliest convenience. She asks that you please call at any hour." He stood there for a long moment, holding the paper. Sterling. He didn't know the name. He folded the paper back up, tucked it in his shirt pocket, and went to work. He thought about it for maybe 20 minutes, somewhere around the third hour of his shift, while he was running diagnostics on a belt conveyor that had been throwing errors all week. He thought, it's probably the hospital, or an insurance thing. Some administrative follow-up he was being pulled into because he'd been the one on the ground. He thought about calling back, and then thought about the 47 other things he needed to do before 9 o'clock. And then the conveyor threw another error code, and the follow-up call relocated itself to the back of his mental queue, where it stayed until he got home that night and found Gracie already in bed and a note from Mrs. Delgado on the kitchen table that said, "Someone called the building number 2. Wouldn't leave details. Said it was important and good news. Rosa." He stood in his kitchen in his work clothes and read the note twice. Then he picked up his phone and dialed. It rang once. A woman answered on the second ring. Not a recording. An actual person, at what was now close to 10 o'clock at night. "Sterling Global Executive Office. How may I help you? This is Ethan Walker," he said. "I'm returning a call." A pause. Brief, but the kind that carried information inside it. "Mr. Walker," her voice shifted not unprofessionally, but noticeably warmer. "We've been hoping you'd call. Please hold just one moment." He held. He looked around his kitchen while he waited. The stack of bills on the counter that he'd been rotating, paying the most urgent one each month and hoping the others would be patient. Gracie's drawing on the refrigerator, a horse she'd been very proud of, held up by a magnet shaped like a pineapple that had come free with a pizza order 18 months ago. The fluorescent light above the sink that hummed at a frequency that had become so familiar he only noticed it when he was actively listening for something else. "Mr. Walker." The voice that came on the line was different from the first one. Lower. Measured. The voice of a person who had spent years in rooms where every word cost something, and had learned accordingly. "Yes," he said. "My name is Victoria Sterling." A pause. "I believe you know who I am." "I don't," he said honestly. "I'm sorry." Should another pause. Longer this time. He had the strange impression that his answer had surprised her. "I own Sterling Global Technologies. I'm told you performed CPR on me Tuesday evening on 5th Avenue, the conveyor on the 3rd floor, the quarterly inventory recount, the washing machine that still owed him 2 quarters. All of it fell completely quiet in his head. "Yes," he said. "I did. The doctors tell me I was clinically dead for approximately 40 seconds before that paramedics were able to restart my heart." Her voice didn't waver when she said it. But he heard something underneath the steadiness, the particular tremor of a person who has said a sentence many times in the last 3 days and is still not entirely used to what it means. The lead paramedic told the hospital that whoever performed CPR before they arrived had done so correctly and consistently enough that there was no significant oxygen deprivation to the brain. She paused. "What that means in practical terms is that I am sitting in this hospital room with my full faculties because of what you did." Ethan sat down on the edge of his kitchen chair. I'm glad you're okay, he said. I owe you my life. You don't owe me anything. The words came out without deliberation, without the social calculation of whether they were the right thing to say. They were just true, and then came out. The true things tend to simply, without decoration. A long silence on the other end. Not awkward. Something else. The silence of a person recalibrating. Why, she said finally. He frowned. Why what? Why don't I owe you anything? You saved my life. You could ask for almost anything right now, and it would not be unreasonable. A pause. I know what I'm worth, Mr. Walker. Most people in your position would know that too. I didn't know who you were when I knelt down next to you, he said. I still don't really know who you are. You were a person who needed help. That's all. A silence. Longer. What's your situation, she said. The question was direct, not invasive, he decided, but direct in the way of someone who had spent so long dealing in abstractions that a direct question felt like relief. Tell me about your life. He almost laughed. That's a big question for 10 o'clock on a Thursday. I have time. A beat. Apparently, I have more of it than I thought. So he told her. Not everything. Not the deep parts, not the parts he kept for himself, and the quiet hours after Gracie went to sleep, but the shape of it. The warehouse job. The second job on weekends doing maintenance at a storage facility in the Bronx. The apartment in Yonkers. Gracie and her school, and the bus stop, and the chocolate milk situation. He told it simply, without self-pity, because self-pity had never paid a bill or gotten him through a shift, and he'd long since stopped seeing the point of it. When he finished, Victoria Sterling was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want to meet you. That's not necessary. It's not about necessity, she said. I'm being discharged on Saturday. I'd like to come to you, if you'll allow it. I won't take much of your time. He looked at the stack of bills. He looked at Gracie's horse on the refrigerator. He thought about saying no. His instinct was to say no, to keep his life and his daughter separate from whatever this was. And then he thought about the fact that he was 30 years old and tired in a way that went past physical, and that sometimes the things that felt most like traps were actually the doors you'd been looking for. Okay, he said. Saturday afternoon, 2 o'clock. Her voice shifted again just slightly. Just enough. Thank you, Mr. Walker. Get some rest, he said. He hung up. He sat in his kitchen for a long time after that, in the dark, with the fluorescent light humming its familiar frequency above the sink, while the city outside his window made its usual sounds of traffic and distance and time. He didn't know what to think, so he went to bed. Saturday arrived with the particular unhurried cruelty of days you are both looking forward to and dreading. Ethan cleaned the apartment not obsessively, but thoroughly, the way a man cleans when he knows someone is coming to who will see the life he actually lives, rather than the one he might have preferred to present. He washed the dishes that had accumulated since Wednesday. He vacuumed the carpet, which was a cheap beige color that showed everything but had come with the apartment and couldn't be argued with. He straightened the stack of bills on the counter and then, after a moment's consideration, put them in the kitchen drawer. Not out of shame. Just because some things were private. Gracie was curious about the cleaning. Who's coming? She said, watching him from the couch with the focused attention she applied to anything she found interesting. Someone I helped a few days ago. Helped how? She needed help. I was there. Gracie considered this with the philosophical patience of an 8-year-old who'd understood she was not getting the full story, but was deciding whether to push on it. Is she nice? She finally said. I don't know yet. Do you think she'll be nice? Ethan sat back on his heels and looked at his daughter. This small person with his wife's eyes and her own very particular brand of relentless curiosity. I think she's trying to be, he said. Sometimes that's enough. At 2 o'clock exactly, there was a knock at the door. He opened it. Victoria Sterling in person was different from the voice on the phone. The phone had given him the composed, measured version, the version that had learned to lead meetings and move markets and keep the tremor out of her voice when she said the word dead. The person standing in his doorway was not composed. Exactly. She was pulled together. She was wearing clothes that probably cost more than his monthly rent, and her hair was very precisely arranged, and her posture was the posture of a woman who had spent 40 years, making sure she looked exactly as capable as she was. But her eyes were different. Her eyes looked like someone who had been frightened in a way that the rest of her presentation hadn't caught up to yet. "Mr. Walker," she extended her hand. "Ethan," he said, and shook it. "Come in." She came in. She looked around the apartment with the same direct attention she'd brought to the phone call, not judgmentally. He thought, but observationally, taking inventory, trying to understand the life that existed in this space. Gracie appeared from the hallway in the specific way that children appear when they've been told to wait and have waited approximately as long as their patience will allow, which in Gracie's case was about 90 seconds. She looked at Victoria with unfiltered directness. "Are you the person my dad helped?" she said. Victoria looked at the small girl for a moment, and something in her expression shifted quietly, like a seam giving way. "Yes," she said, "I am." "He's good at helping," Gracie said, with the absolute confidence of someone stating an observable fact. "He fixed Mrs. Delgado's sink last month and she cried." "Grace," Ethan said. "She did cry, Dad." "Happy crying." Gracie looked back at Victoria. "He does that a lot. Makes people happy cry." Victoria looked at Ethan. He gave a small shake of his head in the way that parents develop as a silent language. "For I cannot explain this, child. I apologize. Also, I wouldn't change it for anything." "Can I get you something?" he said. "Coffee? Please." He went to the kitchen. He heard, from the living room, Gracie continuing to brief Victoria on various matters of importance: the water cycle project, the upgraded status of the horse, drawing from preliminary sketch to finished artwork, the ongoing chocolate milk situation, and its broader implications for school cafeteria justice. He heard Victoria asking questions. Real questions. Not the polite performative questions of an adult humoring a child, actual follow-up questions. The kind that required you to have been listening. He brought the coffee out. Victoria was sitting on the couch. Gracie was next to her, explaining something with her hands, which she did when the subject was important enough to require additional dimensions of communication. They looked briefly like two people who had known each other longer than 4 minutes. The picture of it did something complicated in Ethan's chest, something he didn't fully examine, and set down gently. The way you set down something fragile when you're not sure yet what it is. "Gracie," he said, "let Miss Sterling and me talk for a bit. Okay?" Gracie assessed the request, found it reasonable, and departed with the dignified air of someone who was choosing to cooperate. Her bedroom door closed. Then, 30 seconds later, opened an inch. Ethan left the inch. Some battles weren't worth it. He sat across from Victoria. She was holding the coffee mug with both hands, which he noted because it was the first gesture she'd made that wasn't perfectly calibrated. Just a person holding something warm. "Your daughter," she said, "is extraordinary. She's 8, he said. She thinks she's 38. Where does she get it?" He looked at her. "Her mother." A pause. Victoria held the mug. "I'm sorry," she said. Stopped. Reconsidered. "I did research on you before I came. I wanted to understand who you were. I hope that doesn't feel like a violation. It feels like something a very thorough person would do," he said. She almost smiled. "I lost my husband 7 years ago," she said. "Different circumstances. I know it doesn't matter, the circumstances. Loss is its own category." "Yeah," he said. "It is." They sat with that for a moment. The comfortable silence of two people who have arrived at something true and aren't rushing past it. Then Victoria set down the mug. Her hands went to her lap. Her back straightened incrementally, not defensively. He thought, but the way a person straightens when they're about to say something they've decided to say and want to mean it fully. "I came here to thank you," she said. "But I also came because I don't believe in owing a debt and paying it with money. Not with something like this." She paused. "You saved my life. I can't repay that. What I can do is ask you an honest question." "Okay," he said. "What do you actually want for your life?" The question landed quietly. It didn't make a lot of noise, but it had weight to it, the kind of weight that comes from a question nobody has asked you in a very long time. He looked at the woman across from him, this billionaire sitting on his second-hand couch with her two-hand grip on a coffee mug, and he understood that she was asking genuinely. Not rhetorically. Not as a prelude to an offer she'd already decided to make. She was actually asking. He thought about lying. Not dishonestly, just the social version. The graceful deflection. "I'm fine, we're managing. Things are looking up." He'd gotten good at that sentence. But something about the directness of her, the same directness she'd brought to the phone call, the same quality he'd recognized without having a word for it, made the social version feel like both their time. I want my daughter to grow up, knowing that hard work means something, he said. I want to stop choosing between the electric bill and the grocery bill. I want to do work that uses what I actually know how to do. He paused. I've been fixing things my whole life. Machines, systems, problems nobody else wants to deal with. I'm good at it. But nobody at the level where it pays a real wage is looking at a warehouse tech from Yonkers. Victoria held very still. I'm Gracie to go to college, he said. I want to be at her school events without calculating whether I can afford to take the afternoon off. He stopped. He felt, suddenly, the particular exposure of having told the truth to a stranger. I want things that are probably not that different from what most people want. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Can I tell you what I see, she said. Go ahead. I see someone who, in 8 minutes on a sidewalk, with no training beyond a Wednesday night class years ago, executed a medical procedure correctly, managed a crowd, redirected security personnel, maintained situational awareness, and didn't stop. She said it factually, as if she were reading from a report. That's not a lucky instinct. That's a skill set. The same skills that keep a warehouse running, that solve problems under pressure, that earn the trust of people working alongside you. She paused. I've paid consultants more than you make in a year to walk into a room and do less than what you did on that sidewalk. Ethan said nothing. I have a position, she said, at Sterling Global. Not charity. Not a thank you gift wrapped in a job title. Her voice was precise. Operations problem solving. You would work with our facilities and logistics teams to identify inefficiencies, system failures, and process breakdowns. Things that cost us time and money and that people in expensive offices often can't see because they've never had to be the person who makes it actually work. She looked at him steadily. I believe you would be very good at it. The inch-wide gap in Gracie's bedroom door was silent. Ethan looked at the stack of bills he'd put in the kitchen drawer. He looked at the horse on the refrigerator. He thought about the 30-second conversation he had with himself every morning. Standing in the shower, the one where he cataloged the gap between where he was and where he needed to be, and then got dressed and went to work anyway, because that was the only answer he'd ever found that actually worked. I've never worked in a corporate environment, he said. I know. I don't have a degree, I know. There are people who've been in your industry their whole careers who are going to look at me and see someone who has no business being in the room. Yes? She said. There are. She picked up the coffee mug again. I've spent 40 years being a woman in rooms full of people who thought I had no business being there. She looked at him over the rim. I know how to handle that problem. I can teach you. From behind the inch-wide gap in the bedroom door, a small voice said, Say yes, Dad. Victoria looked at the door. Then at Ethan. He pressed his lips together. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. The way a man looks at the ceiling when he is trying to decide whether what he is feeling is hope or fear, and has realized that at a certain distance, those two things are very difficult to tell apart. I'm afraid, he said. It came out quieter than he intended, more honest than was comfortable. Victoria nodded. Like she'd been waiting for that. Like it was the most sensible thing he'd said all afternoon. Good, she said. The people who aren't afraid are the ones I worry about. He was quiet. You told that woman on the sidewalk not to give up, she said. I know because 2 witnesses mentioned it in separate accounts. She set down the mug. You don't get to give yourself different instructions than you give strangers. The apartment was quiet, except for the fluorescent hum above the sink. Ethan looked at his daughter's closed door, at the 1-inch gap that was not a closed door. That was 8 years old and paying very close attention and had always known, even at 4, even at 3, that her father needed someone to believe in him, the same way he believed in everyone else. He looked back at Victoria Sterling. He said, When do I start? And for the first time since she had appeared in his doorway, Victoria Sterling smiled. Not the managed, calibrated expression of a CEO closing a deal. Something underneath that. Something that looked a great deal like relief. Monday, she said. We'll figure out the rest. From behind the bedroom door, Gracie made a sound that was entirely undignified and entirely joyful. Ethan stood up from his chair He was still afraid. But he had been afraid before, afraid, at the bottom of a sidewalk, with his hands locked on a stranger's chest, and a crowd telling him to stop. Afraid in a hospital corridor at 31 years old. Afraid every morning in the shower, going over the numbers that never quite added up. And he'd shown up anyway. Every time. That was the only thing he'd ever known how to do. He extended his hand to Victoria Sterling. She stood and took it. One condition, he said. She raised an eyebrow. Name it. I have to be at the bus stop by 7:45, he said. Every morning. Non-negotiable. Victoria held his hand for a moment. She looked at the bedroom door, then back at him. Non-negotiable, she agreed. They shook on it. In his kitchen drawer, the bills waited. On his refrigerator, the horse watched. In the bedroom, through the 1-inch gap, Gracie pressed her face to the doorframe and understood, with the particular clarity of a child who has been paying attention her whole life, that something had just shifted. Not fixed, not finished, but shifted. The way a weight shifts when someone else puts a hand on your side of it. Just enough. Monday came the way hard things always come, without asking whether you were ready. Ethan was up at 5:15. Not because the alarm forced him. Because his eyes opened on their own, the way they did when something was waiting that was bigger than sleep. He lay in the dark for exactly 90 seconds, staring at the ceiling, running through the same internal inventory he always ran before a shift. What needed doing? What could wait? What couldn't be controlled and therefore wasn't worth the energy? The ritual had gotten him through 4 years of overnight shifts, 2 years of working doubles, and 1 very long year of learning to function as a single parent on 5 hours of sleep and whatever willpower was stored in the part of a man that doesn't show up on a resume. He got up. He made coffee. He made Gracie's lunch peanut butter and strawberry jam, crusts off, a note tucked inside the way he'd done every school day since 1st grade. Because there were things you kept doing, not because the child asked, but because you understood at some level that the consistency of small things is how love proves itself over time. He ironed his shirt. He owned 2 shirts that were appropriate for a corporate office. He knew this because he'd laid out his entire wardrobe on the bed Saturday night and made an objective assessment, and the number was 2. He'd ordered a 3rd online after the assessment. It wouldn't arrive until Wednesday. So today was shirt 1. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself this several times before Gracie appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:45 in her pajamas, with her hair in every direction, and said, without preamble, "You look nervous." "I look fine," he said. "You ironed your shirt twice." He looked at the shirt. "I was making sure." Gracie padded over and sat at the kitchen table, pulling her knees up to her chest on the chair, the way she always did when she was settling in for a real conversation. She looked at him with her mother's eyes, that particular combination of soft and exact that had always made him feel simultaneously seen and held accountable. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, you jump into things," she said. "That's what you do. You jumped in when that lady fell. You jumped in when Mrs. Delgado's sink was broken and water was going everywhere. You jumped in when Tyler Marsh at my school was being mean to kids, and you came and talked to the principal even though you had to leave work early." She paused. "You're a jumper. The suit doesn't change that." He looked at his daughter. 8 years old. 38 in every way that counted. "Where do you come up with this stuff?" he said. "I listen," she said simply. "You taught me to." He walked over and kissed the top of her head, over her chaotic hair. She tolerated it with the regal patience of someone accepting a tribute. "Bus stop at 7:40, he said. "I know, Dad." He went to Sterling Global Technologies. The building was in Midtown. Glass and steel and the particular studied confidence of architecture, and that wanted you to understand before you walked in that the people inside were operating at a level you should take seriously. Ethan stood on the sidewalk outside for approximately 4 seconds, which was as long as he allowed himself, and then he went in. The lobby was large. The security desk was manned by a man who looked at Ethan's name on a list and picked up a phone without a word. 2 minutes later, a woman in her 30s appeared, trim, professional, moving with the efficient purposefulness of someone who had 7 things happening simultaneously and had made peace with that fact. Her name was Karen Aldridge, and she was, as she explained while walking him to the elevator, Victoria's executive operations coordinator. and she would be orienting him to the building, the team, and what his first 2 weeks would look like. She talked fast. Ethan listened carefully. The elevator opened on the 31st floor. The floor was open plan, a design choice. He understood almost immediately. That was meant to communicate collaboration, but actually communicated that everyone could see everyone at all times, which was a different thing entirely. Heads came up as he crossed the floor. Not many, not dramatically, but he noticed, the way a man who has spent years reading rooms for potential problems notices, that several people looked at him with the specific expression of colleagues who had been told and a thing and were now reconciling that information with what was in front of them. The thing they had been told, he suspected, was a warehouse technician from Yonkers is joining the operations team. Leadership decision. Non-negotiable. He kept walking. Karen showed him his desk. It was a real desk, not a corner or a closet or an afterthought. It had a computer and a phone and a notepad and a pen, and it sat in a cluster of 4 desks, of which 2 were currently occupied. The man at the desk to his left glanced up and then immediately back at his screen. The most efficient possible communication of indifference. The woman at the desk across from him did look up, and she did so directly, which he appreciated. "Rachel on," she said. "Logistics. You're the new ops problem solver." Ethan Walker. He sat down. "Yeah. Sterling's call." She said it without judgment, purely informational. "Sterling's call," he confirmed, in the same tone. She looked at him for another beat. Then she went back to her screen. "Welcome to the floor. Coffee machines by the window. It's terrible. Everyone complains about it and nobody fixes it." He looked at the coffee machine. He looked at Rachel. "I could probably fix it." She looked up. The corner of her mouth moved. "Monday morning and you're already a problem," she said. But she didn't sound like she meant it badly. That was the beginning. The first week was an education in how much Ethan didn't know, and how much he did, and the complicated way those 2 things existed simultaneously. He did not know corporate presentation software at the level people expected. He did not know how to navigate a meeting in which 12 people spent 40 minutes discussing a decision that could have been made in 7. He did not know the particular language of organizational bureaucracy, the euphemisms, the careful verbal packaging, the way disagreement was wrapped in agreement-shaped words until it became nearly impossible to tell what anyone actually thought. He did know how to listen underneath language for what was actually being said. He did know how to identify a system failure at 40 paces by the specific way people talked around it without looking at it directly. And on Thursday of the first week, he knew something was very wrong with the Eastern Distribution Network before anyone had run a formal report. Because he'd spent 2 hours reading through the logistics data Rachel had shown him how to access, and the pattern in the numbers was as clear to him as a fault line in a machine that was still technically running. He went to Karen Aldridge's office. "I need 15 minutes with whoever runs Eastern Distribution," he said. Karen looked up from her desk. "That's James Pritchard, Senior VP. He's been in the building 12 years, I understand." He held up the printed data, 3 pages, annotated by hand, because he'd learned to think on paper. "The routing delays in the Eastern Corridor are being attributed to carrier availability, but the pattern is internal. It's a sequencing problem in the dispatch protocol. Carrier availability is a symptom, not a cause. If it keeps being treated as a cause, the delay is going to compound by Q2, and it's going to cost." He'd done the math. He put the number on the table. Karen looked at the number. She looked at him. She picked up her phone. James Pritchard was 61 years old, had the specific confidence of a man who had been right enough times in a long career to stop worrying about he might be wrong. And he looked at Ethan Walker, the new person, the warehouse tech, the one who'd been brought in by a decision nobody entirely understood, with an expression that was not quite contempt, but was in the vicinity of it. In the polite way that corporate environments package contempt, so it cannot technically be named. "Walk me through it," Pritchard said, leaning back in his chair. Ethan walked him through it. He used the same directness he'd used on the sidewalk, the same economy of communication he'd developed over years, of explaining equipment to people who didn't want to hear that something was broken. He didn't hedge, he didn't overqualify. He showed the data, explained the pattern, named the fix. Pritchard was quiet for a long moment. That's a significant claim, he said, for someone who's been on this floor for 4 days. The data's been there longer than 4 days, Ethan said. I'm just the first person who read it as a machine instead of a report. Pritchard looked at him. The expression had shifted not to warmth, but to a different quality of attention. The attention of a man who is recalculating. I'll have my team run an independent review, Pritchard said. If it checks out, we'll discuss next steps. How long will the review take? A week? Possibly 2. The Q1 cycle closes in 11 days, Ethan said. If the protocol isn't adjusted before close, the compound delay I mentioned starts automatically. You can do the review and the adjustment simultaneously. They don't have to be sequential. Pritchard said nothing for a moment. Then he said slowly, "You're very direct." "I've found that's faster," Ethan said. He left the office. He went back to his desk and sat down and exhaled. Quietly, with his hands flat on the desk surface, in the way he'd learned to decompress. After tense situations pressure down. Breathe slow. Let the adrenaline find its way out. Rachel glanced over from across the desk cluster. "How'd Pritchard take it?" she said. "About how I expected. He didn't throw you out." "No. That's better than some people get," she said, and went back to her screen. The independent review took 5 days. The adjustment was approved in conjunction with the review because Ethan had been right about the timeline, and Pritchard, whatever else he was the kind of man who prioritized not losing money over prioritizing being right. The protocol was corrected. The compound delay was prevented. The number Ethan had put on Karen Aldridge's desk, the cost of not acting, did not materialize. That was the first 2 weeks. Victoria heard about it the same day the review results came back. She called him directly, which surprised him, on the office line rather than his cell, which surprised him more. "I heard about Pritchard," she said. "Good news or bad news, depends on who you heard it from," he said. "The CFO called me," she said. There was something in her voice that he was beginning to recognize, the quality of a woman who was pleased about something and was choosing to understate it for reasons of professional consistency. "He wanted to know who you were. What did you tell him?" "I told him you were someone I'd met under unusual circumstances." A pause. "He's not used to being impressed by operations staff." "I'm not trying to impress anyone," Ethan said. "I'm trying to fix things." "I know," she said. "That's why it works." She hung up. He sat at his desk for a moment, with the phone still in his hand, and he thought about the distance between where he'd been 4 weeks ago, running diagnostics on a belt conveyor, with a torn bag strap and a note from Mrs. Delgado on his kitchen table, and where he was sitting right now. It wasn't comfortable to think about exactly. It felt precarious, like standing on something that might hold and might not, like doing compressions and not knowing yet whether the heart was going to restart. He put the phone down. He went back to work. The weeks continued. What nobody had warned Ethan about, what couldn't really be warned about in advance, was that the hardest part of the new job wasn't the learning curve, and it wasn't Pritchard, and it wasn't the meeting culture, or the corporate language, or the software he didn't know to use yet. The hardest part was what happened inside him at around 7 o'clock on weeknights, when he sat at his new desk in an emptying office and felt, with precise and specific clarity, like a man wearing someone else's clothes. He could do the work. He was learning that faster than he'd expected, and the learning felt like remembering rather than acquiring, like the skills were already there, built up over years of solving real problems in real time with real consequences. And what was new was only the context they operated in. He could do the work. But there were moments, and they came without warning. The way things that are true about yourself always come without warning, when he would look around the floor and see people who had been shaped for this environment, who had learned its language before they could drive, whose confidence in these rooms was structural rather than earned. And he would feel the gap between himself and the frame of the world he'd stepped into, like a physical thing, a weight on his sternum, the particular loneliness of being competent in a place where you do not yet belong. He didn't tell anyone this. He told Gracie he was learning a lot. He told Mrs. Delgado things were going well. He told his foreman Marcus, who called to check in on a Thursday, that the new job was different, but he was managing. He told the ceiling of his apartment, at 11:15 on a Thursday night, that he wasn't sure he could do this. And the ceiling, as ceilings do, said nothing. He was back at his desk at 8 the next morning. It was a Friday in his 6th week when things shifted again. And like the first shift, the woman on the sidewalk, it happened without warning, without announcement, in the middle of an ordinary moment. He was in a conference room. Quarterly operations review. 14 people around the table, a presentation on the screen, and a problem being discussed that had been on the table for 3 quarters and had not been solved. The Western regional warehouses were hemorrhaging throughput time packages, entering the system at one rate and moving through at a significantly slower one. The gap costing the company a number that had begun appearing with uncomfortable frequency in executive reports. 3 consultants had reviewed it. A task force had been formed, and then, in the way of task forces, had produced a report that identified the problem without solving it. Because the report was the deliverable and not the solution, and everyone around the table seemed to have silently agreed that this was acceptable. Ethan had been quiet through the first 40 minutes. He was listening, taking notes on paper the way he always did, building the shape of the problem in his head, the way he built machine problems, from the observable symptoms backward toward the failure point, not from the theoretical framework forward toward the data, which was how most of the people in this room were approaching it. At minute 43, the VP of Western Operations said, with the particular fatigue of a man who had said this before, "If anyone has a perspective we haven't heard, now would be the time." Ethan put down his pen. "The floor layout," he said. Heads turned. "The throughput problem isn't a carrier problem or a staffing problem. It's a floor layout problem. The intake and dispatch stations in all 3 Western facilities are positioned on the same side of the floor, which means every package travels the full diagonal of the space before it can move to the next stage. You're adding 40 to 60 feet of unnecessary movement to every single item that goes through those buildings. Multiply that by daily volume across 3 facilities and you're looking at..." He paused. He'd done the math at his desk 3 days ago when he'd first started looking at the regional data out of pure habit, because he had grown up in warehouses, and warehouse problems felt like first language to him. He said the number. The room was quiet. Not the quiet of disagreement. A different quiet. The quiet of a room full of people recalculating. "That's a facilities restructure," someone said. "That's a significant capital investment. Less than the throughput loss over the next 18 months, Ethan said. "I can show you the comparison if it's useful." Another silence. Then the VP of Western Operations said carefully, "Where did you come from before this?" "Warehouse tech," Ethan said. Yonkers, the VP looked at him. Then he looked at the screen. Then he looked back. "Show me the comparison," he said. What happened after that moved faster than Ethan expected. He was pulled into a working session that afternoon. Then a follow-up the next Monday. By the end of the 3rd week, a pilot restructure had been approved for 1 facility, and Ethan Walker, the man who 4 months ago had been running diagnostics on a belt conveyor with a torn bag, was leading it. He called Victoria that evening. She picked up on the 2nd ring. "They approved the pilot," he said. "I know, the VP called me." A pause. He said, and I'm quoting directly, "Where did you find this man? What did you tell him?" "The truth," she said. "I told him he found me." He was quiet for a moment. Standing in his kitchen, the fluorescent light doing its familiar hum above the sink. Gracie's latest drawing a dog this time, ambitious in its anatomical scope, added to the refrigerator beside the horse. "Victoria," he said. "Yes." "I still feel like I don't belong there." A pause. Longer than her usual pauses. "Do you know what imposter syndrome is?" she said. "I've heard the term. Every person I have ever respected has felt it. The ones who never feel it are the ones I worry about." Another pause. "The floor is starting to respect you. Do you know how I can tell?" "How?" "Pritchard mentioned you in a senior leadership email this week," she said. "He called you operationally insightful. James Pritchard does not call anyone anything positive in writing unless he's genuinely concerned they might leave." Ethan said nothing for a moment. "That's not belonging," he said. "No," she agreed. "But it's the foundation of it. Belonging comes after competence earns trust, and trust earns the room. You're on the 2nd step." She paused. "You didn't feel like you belonged on that sidewalk either. You were there anyway." He leaned against the counter. He thought about the sidewalk, the crowd, the man in the overcoat who had stepped around her, The 2 seconds where he'd stopped and made the decision that wasn't really a decision. That was different, he said. How? He thought about it, honestly. On the sidewalk, there was no time to be afraid. Yes, there was, she said quietly. You were afraid. You did it anyway. That's the only definition of brave that matters. A pause. Ethan, you're doing it again. Same thing. Different sidewalk. He stood in the kitchen for a long moment after she hung up, the phone in his hand, the hum above the sink, the dog on the refrigerator, watching him with the earnest anatomical ambition of a child who had decided dogs were the new subject and had committed fully. He heard Gracie's door open. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, eyes slightly squinted in the way of someone who had been almost asleep and had heard a parent's voice through the wall and chosen consciousness. Dad, she said, hey bug, go back to bed. Were you talking to Ms. Sterling? Yeah. Is everything okay? He looked at his daughter. He thought about what to tell her, the careful version, the reassuring version, the version that protected her from the uncertainty. He'd spent 4 years choosing that version because she'd been through enough uncertainty, and he'd made it his primary job to be the thing in her life that didn't shake. But she was looking at him with her mother's eyes, and her mother's eyes had always been able to tell the difference. I'm figuring things out, he said. It's harder than I expected. I'm still doing it. Gracie considered this. That's basically what you tell me about math homework, she said. He blinked. You always say, it's hard and you're still doing it. And that's the whole job, she said. That's what you always say. He looked at his 8-year-old daughter standing in the kitchen doorway in pajamas, with her hair going in 4 directions. And he felt something move in his chest, something large and quiet and old. The specific emotion that has no clean name, but lives in the space where love and grief and gratitude all occupy the same territory without displacing each other. Go to bed, Grace, he said. Okay, she turned. Then she looked back. You're doing good, Dad. Even when you don't think so. She went to bed. He stood in the kitchen. He thought about what Victoria had said. Same thing. Different sidewalk. He had been off the sidewalk once already. He knew how that ended. He put his phone in his pocket, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. The pilot restructure launched on a Tuesday. He was at the Western facility at 6 in the morning, in a hard hat and steel-toed boots that felt more like himself than any shirt he'd ironed, walking the floor with the facility manager, a 20-year veteran named Doug, who had initially communicated his feelings about being supervised by an outsider through the reliable medium of very clipped answers and very slow walking, and talking through the implementation sequence. By noon, Doug's answers had gotten longer. By 3 in the afternoon, Doug was finishing Ethan's sentences. Not because Ethan had tried to earn him over, because they were both men who had spent their lives on warehouse floors, who understood the honest language of physical systems and practical solutions, and that language was a faster bridge than any professional credential. At 4:30, Doug said, You worked warehouses before this. 10 years, Ethan said. Doug nodded. The nod of a man who was adjusting a previous assessment. Thought you were corporate, he said. Like it was a diagnosis. Not yet, Ethan said. Doug almost smiled. Not ever. If you're smart, he said. None taken. They shook hands at the end of the day. The facility was already moving differently, small changes. But physical spaces respond to physical changes in ways that data models on 31st floor conference rooms don't always predict. And by the end of the first day, the floor was reading as a different place. Ethan drove home. He picked up Gracie from Mrs. Delgado's. He made pasta for dinner because it was fast, and Gracie would eat it without complaint, which was the primary criteria for a Tuesday dinner after a day that had started at 5:15. At the table, Gracie said, How was the warehouse? He looked up from his plate. How did you know I was at a warehouse? Your boots, she said. You only wear the steel toes for warehouses. He looked at his boots by the door, then at his daughter. It was good, he said. It was really good. She smiled, the complete, uncomplicated smile of someone who is happy because someone they love is happy, which is the purest version of the emotion, and the one that 8-year-olds still have access to before the world teaches them to filter it. He smiled back, and somewhere in the building, in the drawer under the counter, the bills were still there. But the number in his bank account had changed. And on the first Friday of his 8th week at Sterling Global, Ethan Walker received his second paycheck, looked at the number on the deposit notification, and sat very still at his kitchen table for a long moment. Then he went to the drawer. He took out the bills. He paid them, all of them. Every single one. He sat back in his chair, in the quiet of the apartment, Gracie asleep down the hall, the fluorescent light doing its hum, the dog and the horse watching from the refrigerator. He put his hands flat on the table. He thought about the night on the sidewalk, the cold, the crowd, the woman in the charcoal blazer, his hands locked and aching. 30 fast hard, stay with me, don't give up, and he understood. Sitting at his kitchen table on a Friday night, with his hands flat on the surface, and the bills paid, something that he had not been able to see from inside, the doing of it. He had not just saved her life that night. He had, without knowing it, begun saving his own. Not the dramatic version. Not the clean narrative of a man who fell and rose. The real version. The one where you get up at 5:15. You iron your shirt twice. You walk onto a floor full of people who have decided in advance what you are. You find the fault in the system that everyone else has been looking past. You learn the language you don't know. You call your daughter from a 31st floor office and tell her you're figuring things out. You show up, day after day after day, until the day you sit at your kitchen table with the bills paid and realize that showing up, faithfully and without exception, is not the consolation prize for not having something better. It is the thing itself. It is the whole thing. And outside his window, the city made its usual sounds, traffic and distance, and time, the same sounds it had always made, the same city it had always been. But inside the apartment, something was different. Something had settled. The weight that had been on his sternum for 4 years, the particular weight of a man carrying more than his structure was designed for, alone had not disappeared, but it had shifted, and sometimes a shift is everything. The story leaked on a Wednesday. Ethan didn't find out from Victoria. He didn't find out from Karen Aldridge or Rachel Ahn or anyone at Sterling Global. He found out because Marcus, his old foreman from the warehouse, sent him a text at 7:48 in the morning that said, "Yo, is this you?" with a link attached. He clicked the link standing on the sidewalk outside the building, 40 seconds before he needed to go in. The article was on a mid-size business news site, not major, not front page, but large enough to have reach. The headline read, "Billionaire CEO Victoria Sterling credits warehouse worker with saving her life, hires him to Sterling Global." Below it was a photo of Victoria at some previous event, and below that a photo of Ethan. Not a good photo. It was from his old warehouse employee ID badge, cropped and enlarged, grainy in the way of photos that were never meant to be public and have become so anyway. He read the first 3 paragraphs. He put his phone in his pocket. He went inside. By the time he reached the 31st floor, he could feel the change in the room, the way you feel a change in air pressure. Not loud, not dramatic, just different. The quality of attention was different. Heads turned in a way they hadn't turned before. 2 people he passed in the hallway made eye contact in a way that meant they knew something and were deciding whether to say it. He sat at his desk. Rachel looked up. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said carefully, "Have you seen the article?" "Yes. It went up last night. It's been shared about 4,000 times since 6 this morning." She paused. "Sterling's PR team has been calling around. I think they're trying to figure out where it came from." "Who wrote it?" he said. "Freelance journalist. Someone who talked to witnesses from that night. A couple of people who filmed it, apparently." She paused again. "Ethan. The comments are," she stopped, "good or bad?" "Both," she said honestly. "A lot of both," he nodded. He opened his computer. He had a 9 o'clock meeting with the Western's facility team on the restructure progress. He had a data review at 11. He had lunch. He'd started eating lunch at his desk because the cafeteria had a particular social energy that required more performance than he had to spare at midday. He had a full day, and a story about him was circulating on the internet, and the day was going to happen regardless. He worked at 9:17. His phone rang. Victoria. He stepped away from the conference room into the hallway to take it. "You've seen it," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. I want you to know that it did not come from anyone on my team. We're investigating the source, But preliminary to AKAs, it was a combination of public witnesses and someone who accessed the hospital visitor log from that week. A pause. I'm sorry. I should have anticipated this. The story was always findable. I should have gotten ahead of it. It's done, he said. What do we do now? A brief silence. He'd noticed early on that Victoria registered directness the way most people registered surprise, with a slight pause, the recalibration of someone who had prepared for a different kind of conversation. PR has 3 options for my response, she said. I wanted your input before I chose one. What are the options? 1. No comment, let it die. 2. Confirm it. Release a prepared statement that controls the narrative. 3. Give an interview, both of us together, that tells the story on our terms. He stood in the hallway, phone to his ear, watching through the conference room glass as his team waited at the table. Which one do you want to do? He said. Option 3, he said immediately. But only if you're willing. This is your life and your story as much as mine. I'm not making this decision without you. He thought about Gracie. He thought about her finding out at school, from another kid, from a phone that got passed around at lunch. He thought about the alternative, which was controlling the story before the story controlled them. Who's the interviewer? He said. I have someone I trust. Long-form journalist, serious publication. She'll treat it with care. When? Saturday, if you agree. At my office. He looked through the glass at his waiting team. 9:22. 7 minutes behind schedule, which in his personal code was a minor emergency. I need to talk to Gracie first, he said. Of course. If she's uncomfortable with it. I don't do it. Understood, Victoria said, completely. He went back into the conference room. He said to the team, sorry for the delay. Let's go. And he ran the meeting efficiently, and without reference to the article, because the restructure was progressing, and the problems on the table were the problems that mattered. And a man who stopped doing the work every time the world got loud around him was a man who would never get anything done. After the meeting, Doug, who had driven up from the Western facility for the review session, pulled him aside in the hallway. Doug was not a man of many words. He communicated primarily through the compression and extension of his silences, and the one he offered now was the kind that meant he had something to say and was figuring out how much of it to give. Saw the article, Doug said. Yeah. A lot of people are going to have opinions about you now. He said it flatly, without decoration. People who didn't know who you were yesterday. I know. Doug was quiet for a moment. You know what I told the floor crew this morning? When 2 of them came in talking about it. What? I told them what I know, Doug said, which is that you spent 8 hours on that facility floor last month in steel-toed boots, talking about airflow and sequencing like a man who actually gives a damn. That's all I know. That's what I told them. He paused. The article can say whatever it wants. That's what I know. He extended his hand. Ethan shook it. Thank you, Doug, he said. Don't thank me, Doug said. Just keep showing up. He drove home that evening, through traffic that seemed thicker than usual. Or maybe it was just that the day had been longer in the ways that have nothing to do with hours. He picked up Gracie from Mrs. Delgado's. In the elevator up to their floor, Gracie was quiet, which was unusual enough that he noticed it immediately. What? He said. She looked up at him. Some kids at school knew about you, she said. They said their parents saw a story about you on the internet. He had been prepared for this. He had been preparing for it since 9 o'clock this morning. But preparation and arrival are different things, and the arrival of it, his daughter's face, the particular uncertainty in it, landed with its own specific weight. What did they say? He said. They said you were famous. Maya said her mom said you were a hero. She paused. Tyler Marsh said his dad said you probably made the whole thing up for money. He kept his expression level. What did you say? I said I didn't think Tyler Marsh's dad had ever saved anyone's life, she said. So probably he should keep his opinions to himself. He looked at his daughter for a moment. Is that wrong? She said, with the sincere ethical inquiry of someone who wanted to get it right. It's a little harsh, he said. But is it wrong? Grace, I'm just asking. He put his hand on top of her head as the elevator opened. She walked under his hand the way she always did, ducking through, without losing the conversation. What actually happened, Dad? She said. All of it? They went inside. He made dinner. While the pasta water boiled, same Tuesday dinner on a Wednesday. because the day had eaten the energy he'd planned to use for something better. He told her all of it. Not the filtered version. The real version. The cold sidewalk. The crowd. The 8 minutes. The phone call from the hospital. Victoria's visit on a Saturday afternoon. The job. The conference rooms. The facility floor in steel-toed boots. The bills paid on a Friday night. Gracie sat at the kitchen table and listened to all of it with the focused stillness she brought to things that mattered. Her chin in her hands, her eyes on his face. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Are you glad you stopped?" she said. "Yes." "Even with all the stuff happening now?" "Yes." She thought about this. "Okay," she said. "Then what do we do about the article?" "Victoria wants us to do an interview," he said. "Tell the story ourselves so we control what's said." "Us? Me and Victoria?" "Not me?" "You're 8. I have opinions," she said. "You also have school on Monday, and I'm not putting you in front of a camera." She accepted this with the dignified restraint of someone choosing their battles. "Will it help?" she said. "Victoria thinks so. What do you think?" He drained the pasta. He thought about the article, about the comments Rachel hadn't finished describing, about Tyler Marsh's father, and whatever he'd decided from his couch about a thing he'd read in 3 paragraphs. He thought about Doug's hand and the weight of it. "I think," he said, "that if people are going to have opinions about my life, I'd rather they have them about the actual thing." "That makes sense," Gracie said. "So you're okay with it?" She considered with great seriousness. "Tell them about the chocolate milk thing," she said, "so people know what my school is really like." He put a bowl of pasta in front of her. "I'll see what I can do," he said. Saturday arrived. The interview was at Sterling Global's Midtown offices. A floor below Victoria's usual space, a room with windows and afternoon light, and the particular careful staging of a space that wanted to communicate authenticity, which Ethan found slightly ironic but didn't say. The journalist's name was Claire Abbott, mid-40s, precise without being cold, the kind of woman who made people comfortable enough to be honest by being honest herself. First, she had done her research. He could tell within the first 3 minutes. Victoria was already in the room when he arrived. She looked different from the apartment visit, fully composed. CEO Victoria, rather than 2 hands on a coffee mug Victoria, but when she saw him come in she stood, which struck him as something she didn't have to do. "Ethan," she said. "Victoria." Claire Abbott shook his hand. "Thank you for agreeing to this," she said. "I want to tell the real story. That means I'm going to ask things that might feel uncomfortable. Is that okay?" "That's okay," he said. That sat. Cameras were small and unobtrusive, professional, but not elaborate. This was going to be print, with a video component. Claire had explained in advance, not a television production. Ethan was grateful for that, without entirely knowing why. "Ethan," Claire said, "I want to start before the sidewalk. Tell me about the year before that night." He hadn't expected that. Victoria, he noticed, had gone very still beside him. He talked about the year before. The double shifts. The machine that kept breaking, and the manager who kept postponing the repair order. The month the water heater went out, and he'd heated water on the stove for 3 weeks while he saved up for the replacement part. The school play Gracie had been in, where she played a tree, the 3rd tree from the left, with significant confidence, and he'd gotten there 4 minutes before the curtain, because the subway had run 40 minutes late and he'd run the last 6 blocks. "Did you make it?" Claire said. 4 minutes before curtain," he said. "Was she glad you were there?" "She didn't see me in the audience until the curtain call," he said. "When she found my face in the crowd, she waved. She broke the whole tree character. The kids next to her broke too. The teacher wasn't happy about it." He paused. "I thought about that night the entire next week." Claire wrote something on her notepad. "The night on the sidewalk," she said. "You didn't know who Victoria Sterling was?" "No." "When did you find out?" When called me at 10 o'clock on a Thursday." "What was your first reaction?" He thought about how to answer honestly. "I thought there was going to be an administrative complication," he said. "Like I'd need to give a statement or sign something." Claire looked at him. "You genuinely didn't know?" "I genuinely didn't know." Claire turned to Victoria. "Victoria, when you found out who he was, a single father, warehouse technician, 2 jobs, what did you think?" Victoria was quiet for a moment. "I thought the world was organized very badly," she said. "That a man with that quality of character and that range of genuine capability was in a position where he was choosing between bills. She paused. And I thought that I had the ability to do something about one specific instance of that. So I did. Some people have said the job offer was charity, Claire said, that you were buying a clean conscience. Victoria's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Ethan's work in the first 90 days at Sterling has identified operational inefficiencies that, when corrected, will save the company more than his annual salary in the first year alone. That is not charity. That is a return on an investment I had the intelligence to make. She paused. If anyone wants to call that charity, they should examine what they actually mean by the word. Claire turned back to Ethan. How has the transition been? Honestly, hard, he said. I don't know the language. I'm learning it. There are people who looked at me and made a decision about what I was before I opened my mouth. That doesn't go away fast. Has it gotten better? Some days. Some days, someone makes a comment, or there's a meeting where I can feel the temperature around me, and I know what it means. You learn to work through it. He paused. I worked in warehouses for 10 years, with people who had different reasons for looking down on things. The feeling is the same. The zip code is different. Claire wrote for a moment. Then she looked up at both of them, together. There's been speculation, and I want to give you both a chance to address it directly about the nature of your relationship. Whether this is more than professional. The room was very quiet. Ethan looked at Claire, then at Victoria. He had the same instinct he always had when someone assumed something about his life, the instinct to correct it plainly, without defensiveness, and move on. Victoria is someone I respect enormously, he said. She is someone who treated a moment of genuine human vulnerability, mine and hers, with honesty and care. She is my employer, and she has become someone I consider a real friend. He paused. She's also someone who, the first time she came to my apartment, made my 8-year-old daughter laugh for 45 minutes. In my experience, that's not nothing. Claire looked at Victoria. Ethan Walker, Victoria said, with measured precision, is the most operationally intelligent person I have hired in 11 years of running this company. He is also the only person who has ever told me, in a professional context, to get some rest. A pause. I found both qualities impressive. Our relationship is exactly what he described. Claire smiled. She made a note. Last question, and I'll ask you both separately. What did that night on the sidewalk teach you? She looked at Ethan first. He was quiet for a moment. That the 2 seconds where you decide whether to step around something or step toward it, that's where everything actually happens, he said. The outcome isn't determined by what you know how to do. It's determined by whether you move. He paused. I've thought about that a lot. She turned to Victoria. Victoria was still for a moment, long enough that the quiet became a thing itself. I spent 40 years building something, she said finally. Buildings and numbers, and a name that meant something in rooms I'd spent decades earning the right to be in. And at the end of that Tuesday evening, none of it was what kept me alive. She paused. A tired man in a worn jacket who had every reason to keep walking chose not to. She stopped. What it taught me is that there's a kind of wealth the economy doesn't measure. And I had been in the business of measuring wealth my entire career without ever encountering the kind that actually matters. She paused once more. I'm paying attention to it now. The interview ran the following Thursday in one of the largest print outlets in the country. Long form, careful. The real story as Claire had promised. The article was shared more than 200,000 times in the first 24 hours. The comments, Rachel reported to Ethan on Friday morning, were running significantly more good than bad. How significant, he said. About 90 to 10, she said. The 10 are being 10. The 90 are. She paused. Ethan, there are people in these comments talking about things that have nothing to do with you and Victoria. There are men in their 50s and 60s writing about their own jobs and their own kids and the time they almost didn't stop for something, and did, and what happened, or the time they didn't stop, and have thought about it every day since. He sat at his desk with that for a moment. The story hit something, she said simply. He knew what it had hit. He'd known it since the sidewalk. There was a version of his life, and of a lot of men's lives that happened in the hours between shifts, in the space between what was required and what was wanted, where the choices that didn't feel like choices were made. Step around or step toward. Keep going or stop. He'd stopped. And the world, it turned out, recognized the choice. Because most of the world had faced that same 2 seconds and knew, in whatever quiet part of themselves they kept that knowledge, exactly what it cost to move toward rather than away. His phone rang at 2:17 that afternoon. A number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go. He answered it. "Is this Ethan Walker?" A man's voice, older, rough around the edges in the way of a voice that had spent decades out of doors. "Yes," Ethan said. "My name is Frank DeLuca. I'm 72 years old. I'm calling from Cleveland, Ohio." A pause. "I read your interview this morning. My son, he's 38, works in logistics, raising 2 kids alone since his wife left 3 years ago. He keeps saying he's going to figure things out. Keeps saying things will get better." Another pause. "I've been trying to tell him what you said. About moving towards something instead of around it. I was wondering if I could." The old man stopped. "I don't know why I called. I just wanted to say it matters. What you did. Both things. The sidewalk and the rest of it." Ethan's sat at his desk on the 31st floor of Sterling Global Technologies and listened to a 72-year-old man from Cleveland trying to find the words for something that didn't have clean words. "Tell your son," Ethan said carefully, "that figuring it out is not something that happens before you move. It happens while you move. You don't get clarity and then start. You start and the clarity comes." A long pause. "That's good," Frank DeLuca said quietly. "That's really good. Can I write that down?" "Write it down," Ethan said. The old man thanked him 3 times and hung up. Ethan sat with the phone in his hand. Rachel was looking at him from across the desk cluster. "You okay?" she said. "Yeah," he said. He put the phone down. He went back to work. He had a 3 o'clock with the Eastern distribution team and a data set to review before then. He had a daughter to pick up at 7:15 and pasta, probably, and a conversation about the day and the water cycle project and the never-ending question of cafeteria justice. He had a full day. He worked through it. At 5:50, his computer pinged with an email. The sender was James Pritchard, Senior VP, 12 years in the building. The man who had looked at Ethan Walker in week 1 with the particular expression of someone who had decided in advance what he was looking at. The subject line was, "Quarterly Operations Recognition." He opened it. The email was a division-wide note, standard format for internal commendations. It named 3 people in the operations division who had made exceptional contributions in the quarter. The first name was someone from the Eastern Logistics team. The second was Rachel On. The third was Ethan Walker. The note next to his name read, "For identifying systemic inefficiencies in both Eastern and Western operational corridors and developing practical solutions that exceeded the performance projections of both task forces. Outstanding applied judgment." He read it twice. Then he forwarded it to one person, his own email address, so he would have it, not for anyone else, for himself, for the 5:15 mornings, and the 2 shirts only Mondays, and the ceiling conversations, and the fluorescent hum, and all the small private evidence that accumulates, piece by piece, into the proof that you are not what the hard years made you feel like. He forwarded it to himself, and he closed his email, and he shut down his computer, and he put on his jacket, and he took the elevator down. Outside, the city was doing what it always did. Enormous and indifferent, and full of people, all of them moving through the same hours in different versions of the same effort. He walked to the subway. He went home to his daughter, and the city closed around him, the way cities do, absorbing everything, remembering nothing, moving always forward, while Ethan Walker rode the train through the underground dark and thought about a 72-year-old man in Cleveland, and a foreman named Doug, and a woman in a charcoal blazer on a cold sidewalk, and his daughter's face in the crowd at a school play when she found him 4 minutes before curtain and broke her tree character entirely. And he thought that if you were going to measure a life, those were the units you measured it in. Not the quarterly recognition emails, not the article shares, not the bank account on a Friday night, though God knew that mattered. The units were smaller and harder to count, and the only way to accumulate them was to keep showing up and keep choosing, at every 2-second decision point that the days kept producing, to step toward instead of away. He had stepped toward once. He intended to keep going. The train moved through the dark. He went home. The 1-year mark came on a Tuesday. Ethan knew it was coming the way you know the anniversary of anything that changed the shape of your life, not because you're counting, but because the body keeps its own calendar, and on certain dates, it reminds you without asking whether you want to be reminded. He woke at 5:15. Same as always. The alarm was almost unnecessary. Now his internal clock had been set to this hour for so many years that it had stopped being an effort and had become simply what morning was. He lay in the dark for his 90 seconds, running his inventory. What needed doing? What could wait? What couldn't be controlled? The ritual was the same. Everything else had changed. He made Gracie's lunch. Peanut butter and strawberry jam. Crusts off, a note inside. She was 9 now, had turned 9 in March, in the particular way that children turn ages, which is to say overnight and completely, so that the person who woke up on her birthday seemed to have arrived from a future he hadn't been fully prepared for. She still wanted the crusts off. He still cut them. Some things held. He ironed his shirt. He owned 7 now, appropriate for a corporate environment. He'd bought them gradually over the year, not all at once, not with the urgency of someone costuming themselves for a role, but one at a time as the paycheck established its rhythm, and the rhythm established its stability, and stability, for the first time in 4 years, stopped feeling like something that could be taken away on a Thursday afternoon without warning. He had not moved apartments. He'd thought about it. Victoria had, gently and once, mentioned that his compensation package would support something larger. He'd considered it for about a week, and then decided he was staying in Yonkers. Because Gracie's school was in Yonkers, and Mrs. Delgado was in Yonkers, and the bus stop was 7 minutes from his front door, and the apartment that had watched him pay all the bills on a Friday night was the same apartment where his wife's presence still lived in certain lights and certain silences, and he was not ready, and possibly would never be ready, to leave that behind. He'd had the water heater replaced professionally instead. Small victories accumulated carefully were still victories. Gracie appeared in the kitchen at 6:50, 9 years old, and already dressed, which was new. The previous year had involved significant negotiations about the relationship between consciousness and clothing. Something had shifted in the summer between 8 and 9. Some developmental threshold crossed, and now she came to breakfast, prepared as if she had places to be and people to answer to, which he supposed she did. "It's the anniversary," she said, sitting at the table. "I know," he said. "Are you thinking about it?" "Not yet. Give me another hour." She poured cereal into a bowl, with the focused care of someone who took breakfast seriously. "Miss Sterling texted me last night," she said, without looking up. He turned from the counter. "She texted you?" "I gave her my number," Gracie said, as if this were the obvious and inevitable outcome of two people who had spent time together and found each other worth continuing to know. "She sends me things sometimes. Articles. Stuff about school programs." She shrugged with the studied casualness of a 9-year-old communicating that something matters. "She sent me a message last night that said to tell you happy anniversary and that she's proud of you." He stood in the kitchen with the coffee in his hand and his ironed shirt and the note already tucked into the lunch bag, and he felt something move through him that he let move through without naming it. Because some things are better experienced than catalogued. "That's nice of her," he said. "She also said she has something to tell you today," Gracie said. "She said it's good news, but she wanted to tell you in person." He looked at his daughter. "She told you that?" "She tells me things," Gracie said. Simply and without apology, we're friends. He shook his head slowly. His 8-year-old daughter had become friends with a billionaire CEO over the course of a year, through text messages and 2 additional visits, and apparently a sustained correspondence about school programs and, he suspected, the chocolate milk situation and its broader implications. The world continued to surprise him in ways he had not budgeted for. "Eat your cereal," he said. She ate her cereal. He took her to the bus stop at 7:40. The November air was the same cold it had been, a year ago, the same pressing, specific cold that found the thin spots in your jacket and didn't negotiate. He stood with her while she waited, their breath visible in the gray morning, and he thought about a sidewalk 40 blocks south of where he lived, and a woman going down hard, and a crowd pulling back, and the 2 seconds that weren't really 2 seconds at all, because they contained an entire life's worth of accumulated decision. The bus came. Gracie hugged him longer than usual, long enough that he registered it was deliberate, that she'd planned it. She pulled back and looked up at him with her mother's eyes. "You did good, Dad," she said. "This year. You did really good." The bus door closed. He stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and watched the bus move down the street until it turned and disappeared. And he breathed, once, slowly, through the full weight of what a 9-year-old's evaluation could do to a grown man's composure. Then he straightened his jacket, and he went to work. The 31st floor looked different to him now than it had on the first Monday a year ago. Not physically, the desks were the same. The coffee machine was still technically broken despite 3 repair attempts and one new machine that had developed its own personality-related issues. But the room had changed, in the way rooms change when you've occupied them long enough that they stop performing for you and simply become where you are. People greeted him by name now. Not all of them warmly, because corporate environments did not run on warmth so much as on utility and respect, but by name, which was its own category of recognition. Rachel looked up when he passed her desk and said happy anniversary with the flat delivery she used for anything she actually meant. He said thank you the same way and sat down. Karen Aldridge appeared at his desk at 9:05 with the expression she wore when something was in motion. "Victoria wants you at 10:30, she said. "Conference room A. Full board table." He looked up. Full board table was Karen's shorthand for a meeting with the senior leadership team. He'd been in those rooms several times in the past year, increasingly often in the past quarter, but the phrase still carried weight. "What's the agenda?" Victoria didn't say, Karen said. She walked away before he could ask anything else. He spent the time between 9 and 10:30 doing what he always did when something was pending that he couldn't control. He worked. He had a logist review from the Western facilities, a second quarter comparison that the operations team was preparing, and 3 emails from Doug that required real responses rather than the corporate equivalent of a nod. He worked through all of it. The work steadied him the same way it always had, not by distracting him from what was coming, but by giving his hands and his mind something honest to do while the rest of him waited. At 10:28, he took the elevator up 2 floors to the executive suite. Conference room A was a room designed to communicate authority. Long table, good chairs, the kind of windows that made the city look like a diagram of itself. He'd been in this room before and had learned to look at the people rather than the room, because the room was just a box and the people were the actual situation. There were 8 people around the table. The CFO, 2 board members he recognized from previous meetings, the VP of Western Operations, Pritchard, Karen, 2 people he didn't know well, a woman he believed was on the legal team, and a man who had been introduced to him once at a company event and whose role he couldn't immediately place. And Victoria at the head of the table. She stood when he came in. Again. He'd noticed she did this, stood when he entered a room, which was a small thing, and also not a small thing. Because Victoria Sterling did not do small things accidentally. "Ethan," she said. "Sit down, thank you for coming." He sat. He looked around the table. Nobody was performing. Nobody had the anxious or pitying energy of people waiting on bad news. The room had a different quality, taut, but not in the way of danger. In the way of something that had been held for a while and was about to be released. "You've been with us for a year," Victoria said. She didn't look at notes. She rarely did. "I want to say publicly and on the record to everyone in this room that the contribution you've made to this organization in 12 months has been extraordinary." She paused. "I also want to be direct about something, because directness is a quality I learned to value from you, and it would be inconsistent of me not to apply it here." The room was completely still. "The position we created for you a year ago was real," she said. "It was not charity and it was not symbolic. You have proven that beyond any reasonable measure of doubt." A pause. "But it was also a beginning. And what I want to discuss today is what comes after a beginning." She looked at Pritchard. He sat forward slightly. Ethan understood, in the particular way that a man who has spent years reading rooms for machinery problems reads them, the way alignment in a conversation has a physical signature. If you know what to look for, that this had been discussed before he arrived, that this room had been arranged with intention. "We're restructuring the operations leadership structure," Pritchard said. He said it with the directness of a man who had made his peace with the recalibration that Ethan's year had required of him. Global Operations Director is a new position. It doesn't currently exist. It would sit above the VP tier, below the Executive Committee. A pause. It would be responsible for identifying and resolving systemic operational failures across all divisions, all geographies, strategic and practical both. He paused again. We want you to build that role. Ethan did not move. The room waited. He looked at Victoria. She was watching him with the same quality of attention she'd brought to his apartment a year ago, the inventory quality, the genuine curiosity about what he was going to do with a thing she'd placed in front of him. Why now, he said. Pritchard answered, which surprised him. Because you've spent 12 months proving that the way we solve operational problems at this company has been limited by the fact that we've always solved them from the top, looking down, he said. You solve them from the structure outward. That's a different methodology, and it works better. We want to institutionalize it, a pause. And because the Q3 results came back, and the combined impact of your interventions on the eastern and western corridors alone produced a 9% efficiencies improvement across those divisions. In this company, at this scale, that number is, he said the number was large. The position comes with a compensation package, Victoria said. She named a figure, and an equity component, and the ability to build your own team. Ethan sat at the table. He thought about the apartment, the bills in the drawer, the 2 shirts appropriate for a corporate environment, the belt conveyor throwing error codes on a Tuesday afternoon in a warehouse in Yonkers while the fluorescent light did its hum and the month's math didn't add up. He thought about the 90 seconds on the ceiling every morning and what it had felt like to run them when the numbers were always behind. He thought about Gracie at the bus stop. You did good. Dad, you did really good. He thought about a woman in a charcoal blazer on a cold sidewalk. And the 2 seconds where a crowd pulled back and he moved forward, not because he had a plan, but because standing still had never been something he was built for. I need to ask you something first, he said. Victoria inclined her head. This role, he said. The way I'd build it, I would spend time on actual floors, actual facilities. I would require my team to do the same. I would not run this from a conference room. He looked at the people around the table. And I would require the ability to escalate directly to this table when I find something that needs to be heard, without a 6-week approval process, without the language getting cleaned up before it arrives. He paused. If those conditions aren't real, I'm not the right person for the role. Pritchard looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Ethan. Those conditions, she said, are exactly why you're the right person for the role. He sat with that for a moment. Then yes, he said. I'll do it. And the room, which had been waiting on that answer, exhaled. Pritchard extended his hand across the table. Ethan shook it. The handshake was different from every previous version of that gesture, between them not warmer. Exactly. But honest in a new way, the honesty of 2 people who have been through something real together and no longer need to perform around it. After the meeting, when the others had filtered out with the purposeful momentum of executives whose A-Day had resumed, Victoria sat at the end of the table, and Ethan sat 2 seats down. And the room was quiet. Scared, she said. Yes, he said. Good, she said. Same thing she'd said a year ago in his apartment. Same word, same weight, he smiled. First one of the day. You always say that. Because it's always right. She leaned back in her chair. For a moment, she looked less like the CEO of a billion-dollar company, and more like the woman who had held a coffee mug with 2 hands in his second-hand couch, and asked him what he actually wanted for his life. You know what the difference is between you and the last 3 people who sat in senior leadership meetings in this building and didn't work out. Tell me. They wanted the result, she said. You want the problem. The actual problem. The broken thing. You are constitutionally incapable of walking past something that isn't working right. She paused. On a sidewalk, in a warehouse, in a quarterly data set. It doesn't matter the context. You cannot leave a broken thing alone. She looked at him steadily. That is not a common quality. I have been looking for it for 20 years. He was quiet for a moment. He thought about what she'd said, constitutionally incapable of walking past something that isn't working right, and recognized it as a description of himself that he had never had the language for. that had always felt like just the way he was, the basic fact of how he moved through the world. "Is that what happened that night?" he said. "With you?" She held his eyes. "What do you mean?" "You were a broken thing," he said quietly. "Not cruelly. Just factually, and I couldn't walk past it." She was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that he wondered if he'd said it wrong. "Yes," she said finally. "That's exactly what happened." She paused. "And the other way around." He thought about that. "The other way around," he said. "You were broken too," she said simply. Just quietly. The way some people break without making a sound, without asking for help, without stopping long enough for anyone to notice. She paused. "I noticed. Because I was paying attention, once I had the chance to." She looked at the table for a moment. "I'd like to think we both did something about each other." The room was very quiet. Outside the windows, the city was doing what it always did. Moving. Carrying everyone in it forward through the hours. Indifferent to what any one person had figured out, or lost, or found, or built. "Victoria," he said. "Yes. Thank you." She looked up at him. And for the second time since he had known her, the first being the afternoon in his apartment when Gracie had described his effect on Mrs. Delgado's plumbing situation, Victoria Sterling's composure showed something underneath. Not weakness. Something older than that. The particular openness of a person who has been seen accurately and is still getting used to how that feels. "Go call your daughter," she said. He stood. "She's in school. She'll want to know." "She already knows," he said. "She told me this morning you had good news." Victoria looked at him. Then she did something he had seen exactly twice before in a year of knowing her. She laughed. Full, unguarded. The laugh of someone who had been outmaneuvered by a 9-year-old, and found it genuinely funny. He left her laughing and went back to work. What came next moved faster than the first year had, which he hadn't thought was possible. Building the global operations director role from the ground was exactly what it sounded like. There was no template, predecessor, no existing structure to inherit. He had to design the methodology, build the team, establish the protocols for escalation, and do all of this while continuing the operational work that had earned the position in the first place. He routinely worked 12-hour days. He routinely drove home at 8 o'clock and made dinner for a 9-year-old who had usually already eaten something at Mrs. Delgado's and was waiting for him more for the company than the food. He was at the bus stop every morning at 7:40. Non-negotiable. He had told Victoria this the day she hired him, and he kept it without exception. And the keeping of it was not a small thing to him. It was the daily proof that the life he'd built in the office had not consumed the life he was building it for. He assembled his team over 3 months. 4 people to start. He'd asked for 6 and accepted 4, which was a negotiation he'd expected and won partially and considered an acceptable outcome. He chose deliberately. A woman from the logistics department who everyone described as difficult and who he identified, after one 30-minute conversation, as the particular kind of difficult that comes from being right more often than the people around you, and not knowing what to do with that. A younger man from facilities who reminded him, uncomfortably and usefully, of himself at 26, all competence and no language for the room he was in. A data analyst from finance who had been filing observations about operational inefficiencies in monthly reports that nobody was reading. For 2 years, with the patient persistence of someone who believed in process, even when process wasn't listening. He read 2 years of her reports in one night. He called her the next morning. "Someone read them," she said, when she picked up. The words came out with the specific weight of a person who had stopped expecting this and couldn't immediately elaborate. "I read them," he said. "You were about the Chicago corridor 3/4 before anyone ran a formal review. Tell me how you got there," she told him. For 40 minutes. He listened to every word. She started on his team the following Monday. The team worked the way he worked, from the floor, outward, from the actual problem backward. They traveled. They put on hard hats. They talked to the people who moved the product and not just the people who watched the numbers that tracked the product. Because the information that lived on floors and in shift changes, and in the particular way a loading supervisor said, "It's fine," when they meant it's been broken for 6 months, and we've stopped filing tickets, that information was not in any report. You had to go get it. They got it. In the first 18 months of the role. The interventions Ethan's team identified and implemented produced a measurable operational improvement across 9 divisions. The number appeared in the annual report, on a page that Ethan did not read until Rachel sent it to him with a one-line email that said, "Page 47. Don't be weird about it." He was a little weird about it. He printed page 47 and put it in the kitchen drawer, under the bills that were no longer there. The pivot that nobody expected, including Ethan, came on a Thursday afternoon, in his second year in the role, when a man named Gerald Holt from the HR leadership team appeared at his desk and sat down without asking, which was unusual enough that Ethan looked up from his screen. Gerald Holt was 64 years old, 2 years from retirement, and had the specific gravitas of a man who has spent 40 years watching the interior lives of organizations and has formed very settled opinions about what makes them work. He looked at Ethan with the direct appraisal of someone who has decided to say a thing and is doing the courtesy of making eye contact while he does it. "I've been watching what you've built," Gerald said. "Okay," Ethan said. "The team you assembled, the methodology you're running, the way you engage the floor-level staff across the facilities." He paused. "It's not just an operational model. It's a leadership model. And it's producing something I haven't seen in 20 years of watching this company." "What's that?" Ethan said. "Trust," Gerald said. "Floor trust. The people who actually move the product trust the people in this building in a way they didn't a year ago. Because someone from this building started showing up in their space and listening to them, and then doing something about what they said." He leaned forward slightly. "Do you understand what that's worth?" "I have some idea," Ethan said. "We're building a leadership development program," Gerald said, "targeted at people in operational and technical roles who have the capacity for senior leadership but have been consistently overlooked because they don't have the conventional credentials or the conventional path." He paused. "I want your methodology to be the foundation of it, and I want you to be involved in designing it." Ethan sat back. He thought about the man in the 36 from Cleveland, with the son in logistics, raising 2 kids alone. He thought about his own 7-year-old self, watching his father come home from a shift and not being able to explain why the coming home felt like the most important thing that happened every day. He thought about the data analyst who had been filing correct reports into a void for 2 years. Patiently, with the faith of someone who believed in process, even when process wasn't listening. "Yes," he said. It was the same word he'd said in conference room A. Same quality of decision. No hesitation at the front of it. Just the honest assessment of a man who knew what mattered and moved toward it. "Good," Gerald said and stood up. "Gerald," Ethan said. He turned. "The program," Ethan said. "The people it targets. I want a specific condition. Name it, we go find them," Ethan said. "We don't wait for them to apply. We go to the facilities, the floors, the warehouses. We look for the person who's been filing the right report into a void for 2 years. The one who knows why the machine is actually broken, not just what the error code says. The one everyone describes as difficult." He paused. "We go find them. Because they won't come to us. They've been told too many times that the door isn't open." Gerald Holt looked at him for a long moment. "Consider it a condition," he said. 3 years and 4 months after a cold November evening on a Manhattan sidewalk, Ethan Walker stood in a conference room at Sterling Global Technologies and looked at a group of 11 people who had been found, rather than recruited, pulled from floors and facilities and operational roles across 5 divisions, because someone had gone looking for them specifically. 11 people who had correct instincts and practical competence and the particular combination of patience and stubbornness that it takes to keep filing the right report when nobody is reading it. He looked at them, and he saw what he recognized. He saw himself on a sidewalk, not the dramatic version, the real version. The version where you're tired, and your bag strap is torn, and your hands are aching, and you see something in front of you that needs doing, and the entire crowd is moving the other direction, and you have exactly 2 seconds to decide who you are going to be. He told them that. He started with that. "You are here," he said, "because someone was looking for you. That doesn't happen as often as it should. I know that. Most of you have been in rooms where you had the right answer, and nobody asked the right question." He paused. "This room is different. In this room, the question is already on the table. The question is, What do you know how to do that? The people above you, in every room you've ever been in, couldn't see. He looked at each of them. We already know the answer is something. We went and found you because the answer is something. This program is about learning the language of the room well enough that the something you know can actually be heard. The room was quiet. A woman in the third row, the logistics manager from the Atlanta facility, who had been described in her HR file as resistant to upward feedback, and who Ethan had identified as someone who had been right about 3 significant process failures and had been overruled each time without explanation, raised her hand. What if we learn the language, she said, and the room still doesn't listen? He looked at her. Then you call me, he said. That's why my number is on the program materials. Not as a symbol, as an actual phone number. She looked at him. Then she nodded. The specific who has been promised things before, and is filing this one in a separate category. Not quite belief yet, but open to evidence. He accepted the nod. It was enough to start with. After the session, he called Gracie. She was in 7th grade now, and had a phone of her own. A concession he had made after a month of negotiations that she'd approached with the strategic patience of a person who understood that time was on her side. She picked up on the second ring. How'd it go? She said. Good, he said. Really good. Were they nervous? Some of them. The good kind. What's the good kind of nervous? The kind that means you know it matters, he said. Upon, he heard the familiar sounds of the apartment in the background, the particular acoustic of the place that had absorbed 4 years of hard mornings and bill-drawer Fridays, and fluorescent gym, and one note from Rosa Delgado on a kitchen table, that had started something he hadn't known he was ready for. Dad, she said. Yeah. Mom would have liked this. He stood in the hallway of Sterling Global Technologies and held his phone, and breathed through the specific quality of that sentence, which landed the way his daughter's true sentences always landed, directly, without softening, carrying the full weight of what was meant. Yeah, he said, she would have. Okay, Gracie said. Come home. I made pasta. You made pasta. It's not perfect, but it's not bad. I'll be home by 7:30. Non-negotiable, she said, in the exact tone he'd used with Victoria Sterling 3 years ago, and hung up. He stood in the hallway for a moment, phone in his hand, and he let the year compile itself inside him, the anniversary morning and the bus stop, and Gracie's hug and the conference room, and Gerald Holt and the 11 people and the woman in the third row and the phone number on the program materials and the note in the kitchen drawer where the bills used to be. He let it compile. Then he put his phone in his pocket, and he took the elevator down, and he walked out into the city that had been moving this whole time without pause. Enormous and indifferent and full of people all carrying their own inventories of what they'd lost and what they'd built and what they were still in the middle of building. He walked to the subway. He rode the train home. He ate pasta that was not perfect and not bad, at a kitchen table with his daughter, who told about a history project and a conflict with a friend that had resolved itself, and a book she'd started that she thought he should read, and he listened to all of it, every word, because that was who he was. And when Gracie was in bed, and the apartment was quiet, and the fluorescent light was doing its faithful, familiar hum above the sink, Ethan Walker stood in his kitchen one more time and looked at the refrigerator, where the horse and the dog had been joined over 3 years by a rotation of drawings that documented his daughter's developing understanding of the world, horses and dogs and a solar system and a self-portrait, and a careful rendering of the bus stop in winter, their breath visible in the drawing the way it had been visible that morning. He looked at it all. He thought about what Victoria had said in the conference room on the anniversary. The other way around. You were broken too. He had been, and he was not now. Not fixed. Fixed was not a human condition, and he knew too much about actual broken things to believe that systems returned to factory settings. But rebuilt. Rebuilt from what remained after the hardest years, which was more than he'd thought at the time. Rebuilt by the choice, repeated daily, to show up, to move toward, to kneel down in the cold when a crowd pulled back and do the thing that needed doing with the hands he had and the training he'd accumulated, and the stubborn, structural inability to walk past a broken thing and leave it. That was who he was. It had always been who he was. It had taken a cold sidewalk and a woman in a charcoal blazer, and a phone call at 10 o'clock on a Thursday, and a second-hand couch, and a 9-year-old who told him to be brave, and a foreman named Doug, and a data analyst filing correct reports into a void, and 11 people in a conference room, and years of 5:15 mornings and pasta that was not perfect and not bad. It had taken all of it to show him what had always been true. And now he knew. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to bed. And the city went on outside his window, full of sidewalks and crowds, and cold evenings, and moments that lasted 2 seconds, and contained everything, and somewhere in all of it. In the ordinary Thursday evenings, and the delayed trains, and the bills in the drawer, and the notes in the lunch bags, the actual shape of a life was being made, one choice at a time, by the people who refused to keep walking. Ethan Walker had stopped, and everything that was good in his life had grown from that single, exhausted, ordinary act of stopping, turning toward instead of away, of pressing his hands down and counting and saying, to a stranger, and to himself, and to every version of the future he couldn't see yet, don't give up. He didn't give up. And that made all the difference.